This is the first year they're on this program.
Yeah.
This is the first year that they're on this program.
This is the second.
Second year.
Yeah, the second. The first presentation is recorded. I just haven't sent it to Andy to post. So, okay. All set? Great. I'm going to close that door. Oh, okay, great. Thanks. All right. All right. So, welcome to presentation number 2. And this is, first session we talked about God, and God is the foundation of the Torah, so it made sense to start there instead of start with Torah. So I'm going to begin today with a joke that was told to me when I was in rabbinical school by my liturgy professor, Rabbi Jacob Petakovsky, who actually studied, was a student of Leo Beck, who was a very famous rabbi, both prior to and during the Second World War. And so he tells a story something like this. The Jewish people got tired of the Torah and keeping the Torah and all the complications, keeping the Sabbath, and just got tired of it. And so they prayed to God to give back the Torah. They wanted to give back the Torah. And so God listened, and God said, okay, meet me back at Mount Sinai and I'll take back the Torah. So not only did they bring the Torah, but they brought all the books that commented on the Torah, all the books that were written afterwards, all the codes and how to do things according to what the Torah. They brought volumes and volumes and volumes. And when the moment of truth came, a hand came out of the sky and took back the scroll. And the people said, what about all these books? And God said, that's what you did.
Very good.
So keep that in mind as we go through. There's really two parts to this presentation. And please feel free to always ask a question if you don't understand, or if you have a comment, don't hesitate. So today I'm going to talk about 2 ideas about the Torah. And that relates to some extent to how we understand and how we apply Torah in our lives. One is a traditional view, and that will consume, unfortunately, most of the presentation today. And hopefully we'll get to the second part, which is the what we call the documentary hypothesis theory. One asserts that the Torah was dictated by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, and the other one tells of looks at it from a scholarly point of view and works from the assumption that the Torah was created by human beings. And God was part of the narrative, but eventually these things were written down. Eventually they were put into the final form that we have. And I'll go through the various steps. Just to give you a preview of what's called the documentary hypothesis theory. There's 4 divisions in this. One is the J, which stands for Yahweh, which is the English of Adonai, Yehovah. If you read it exactly, the Yud in transliteration becomes a J. That's how you get Jehovah. And Yahweh is a sort of a weird transliteration. But that's the earliest period. And J appears associated usually with the word Yud Ke Vav Ke, what's called the Tetragrammaton. So passages that have that language in there is usually associated with J. The second, and that I'm sort of getting into it, but I just want to set the stage for that later on when we get to it. The second is the Elohist or Elohim, where God's name appears as Elohim. In Rabbinic Judaism, it's understood to be the attribute of justice, or the essence of God being justice. Those portions that are strict, that have strict laws in them, such as such as the laws of kashrut, the laws of sacrifices. Most of Leviticus is understood to be the oh, I'm sorry, not that, excuse me, E, and it's spread throughout. It's not just limited to a certain section. J also is not limited to just Genesis, though the bulk of J is attributed to is based on the book of Genesis. The E is Elohist. That's more of a strict of a God of justice and portions relating to that kind of those passages that relate to that that's a little bit later, maybe 8th century BCE. Then we get into P, which is priestly. A lot of Leviticus is based on that. Some of this, obviously, the sacrifices, as well as some of the strict laws of purity and impurity that are spread throughout. So that's P. And then D is Deuteronomy, which you can guess most of D, in fact, all of D is attributed to Deuteronomy. And that gets us into about the 7th century or 6th century BCE. Now, when things begin come in the final form, there's a lot of dispute as to this redactive period, how long it went on for, who were the redactors, when was the Torah in its final form that we have today. There's lots of disputes on that, and we'll come to that. I'm just kind of setting the stage for that, okay? So you have these two theories. One is the Torah was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, and the other one basically asserts that it was written by human beings, written and utilizing God's name. Probably, I would posit that these were oral narratives that eventually took the form of a writing. I mean, if you were looking at it from a scholarly point of view, eventually these oral traditions became written down and eventually became what we know as a Torah, if you're adopting the documentary hypothesis theory. Okay? All right. But let's take the most complicated one, which is the traditional understanding, which is a religious concept of Torah is that God dictated the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. Moses transcribed it with 100% accuracy, and that's the Torah that we have today. What exactly is this Torah is unclear. What exactly is the text referring to when God tells Moses to come up after he breaks the tablets, and he's going to give, if you look at Exodus 24:12, give the Torah, mitzvah, and hora'ah, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, most traditionalists agree it's what we have in the Ark. But there's other portions in the Torah that appear later on. For example, there's a Torah portion that's called Bahar, at the mountain, that describes certain laws that were supposed to happen when the Jews entered Israel. For example, letting the land fallow in the 7th year, the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year. These appear not when the Torah is actually given at Mount Sinai according to tradition, but appear later on. How do we account for those? I could give other examples other than that. For example, the Holiness Code, chapter 19 of Leviticus, it has all these wonderful ethical principles. You shouldn't have false weights. You should help your enemy if your enemy is struggling. For example, if a donkey that is carrying a load falls in the middle of the road, even though he's not your brother, you should help, reload the animals. All kinds of love your neighbor as yourself. That's in the Holiness Code, which is Leviticus 19. That doesn't appear until much later. In fact, the story of the golden calf, which you would expect based on the movie, takes place right after, when Moses is coming down off the mountain and he smashes the tablets. No, there's many chapters, I believe, probably about 11 chapters later does the story of the golden calf appear after the giving of the Torah, or after Moses is told to go up to the mountain and receive the Torah, the mitzvah, and the hora'ah, the instruction. Well, I'll get to that in a second, okay? But this is how traditionalists view all of that. So there are some problems with that. And so how do they handle that? How do they maintain, on the one hand, that things appear out of order that should appear when Moses goes up and comes down, all the laws, if they were given at Sinai, why do some appear later on? So there are certain rabbinic principles that answer that question. And I'll say them first in the Hebrew, and then I'll translate so you'll understand. So there's a principle in rabbinic Judaism, ein mukdan ve'ein me'uchar. The Torah has no beginning and has no end. The Torah is not concerned with chronology. Now, there's some benefits to that. The most obvious benefit to that is evolution, right? Because even if the Torah gets it wrong regarding when things were created in order, doesn't matter, because ein mukdam ve'ein mu'achar. The Torah is not concerned with chronology. The Torah is not concerned with things being in proper chronological order. It's not that kind of literature. So it doesn't matter that it appears later on. So that's how in traditional Judaism they handle that. Yes, I see there's a question.
Doesn't that come in accord with what you said last week about God having no beginning?
That God has no, what, I'm sorry.
No beginning?
Yeah, it kind of accords with that.
It comes in accord with God, doesn't it? The Torah.
Well, yeah, God has no beginning and God has no end, right? And the Torah, now there's some midrash, but I don't want to get into midrash right now because I haven't told you what midrash is, okay? What midrash is and what it's important, because you may go to other temples, you may go to other synagogues, and the person who's giving the Torah, who's giving the Devar Torah, giving the sermon, may not differentiate between the two. They may say this is in the Torah when it's actually not in the Torah. They're actually drawing on a midrash, which is a different text than the Torah itself. Oftentimes, people will conflate the two, and that's not accurate, and it should be accurate. What the Torah says is what the Torah says. What we comment on and what's described later, that's a different story. Okay? So far, so good? All right. And finally, Anne, you were here, but I'm going to repeat this. And there's another logic problem. In the last chapter of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. All right? Now, if Moses was dictated the Torah, well, who wrote the last 3 verses of the Torah? Because it describes Moses's life. It describes how great Moses was. Well, if Moses was dead, then who wrote the last 3 verses if everything was dictated by God to Moses? Again, it's a logic problem, right? It's a difficult problem. So there's midrash that tries to answer that question. So they offer 3 explanations. One is that Moses wrote it himself. Moses knew what was going to be the end of his life, that he was not going to get into the promised land when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, which has some underlying existential truths for us. None of us are going to get to the promised land that we envision. And we have to know that. We know that going in, so to speak. And he knew that. And nevertheless, he fulfilled what it was that he was supposed to fulfill. That's one. Another is that Joshua, because Joshua had been chosen to be the successor, Joshua got smicha, the laying of the hands, to be the next leader of the Jewish people. And he wrote the last 3 verses as a tribute to Moses. And finally, God wrote the last 3 verses as a eulogy for Moses. So the last 3 verses could be interpreted as a eulogy for Moses. That's midrash. The text doesn't explain that conundrum. So I want to be clear about that. That's not in the Torah, what I just told you. Okay. Now, if you look at Exodus 24:12, and you operate from the assumption that the Torah can't be redundant. Why can't the Torah be redundant?
Word of God.
It's the word of God. God's the perfect author. God knows exactly what God wants to say. So whatever's in the Torah has to have significance. All right. So now I'm going to quote Maimonides. So if you look at 24:12, why don't I just read it to you so you're clear? And then we have some Bibles back there. It's just one verse. It's not, you don't really have to. If you want to get up and take a look at it, you can, but you don't really need to do that. Let's see. And we want to welcome the people who are online. It's very, very nice to have you with us. Let's see here.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
do you want to tell the people online that they can unmute if they ever have a question?
what's that?
You want to just remind them they can unmute if they have a question?
Oh, very good, thank you. I've just been reminded by our technician that if you want to ask a question or make a comment to people who are online, you just need to unmute yourself and either ask a question, or if you have a comment, that's fine as well, of course. All right. So if we go to Exodus 24, verse 12. Let's see. Right, okay. Okay, so it says here, and God said to Moses, "Come up to me upon the mountain and be there, and I will give to you the tablets of stone." That's understood to be maybe the 10 Commandments. Okay, the Torah. Okay? That's the word Torah. That's the Hebrew. The mitzvah and the mitzvah. Okay, that I have written the whole hatam to instruct them. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. All right. So we have 3 words. I mean, the Luchot HaEvan, the tablets of stone, that I'm not going to focus on. That's pretty clear. But we have a redundancy, right? We have a Torah, we have a mitzvah, and then we have the Hohatam to instruct them. Hoha'ah is instruction. So far, so good? Why do we have 3 when all God has to say is, "Come up to me and I will give you the Torah"? Why these other terms? And okay, so the word mitzvah in the verse is understood in rabbinic Judaism. That is, the rabbis, the Pharisees, for example, and even before, according to Maimonides, refers to the oral Torah, the oral law. And the oral law comes in significant part to explain the written law. I'll give you just some simple examples. Does everyone know what a mezuzah is? It's one of those objects like an amulet that has the Shema in it, and you fix it to your door and you nail it and you recite a blessing to indicate that it's a Jewish home and it's a home devoted to God. It says mezuzah when we recite the Shema, right? But it doesn't tell us how to make it. What does it consist of? This parchment stuff. What parchment goes in it? How do you make one? The oral law tells us how to do that. Matzah. All it says in the Bible is that you should make matzah, but it doesn't tell us how to make the matzah. It doesn't describe, okay, you set the oven at 350 and you've got the flour and you cook it for 18 minutes. It doesn't say anything like that. That's where the oral law comes in. Tefillin, some of the phylacteries that observant Jews or Jews in the morning will bind them on their hand, straps, the leather straps, and they put frontlets, they have a head tefillin. Nothing in the Torah tells us how to make those. Okay, the oral law tells us how to do that. Okay, so how do we know that there was this oral law? Well, because we have the word mitzvah. That's what that word means. Who tells us how that's what it means? Well, long ago, sages, rabbis. If you read Maimonides and you read his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, which is fascinating, that's a whole course in itself, just the introduction. He describes this chain of tradition Moses gave the Torah to the 70 elders in Joshua, and then Joshua transmitted it to like the judges, and then from the judges to Samuel, and then from Samuel, a whole chain of tradition that went all the way to the redaction of the Talmud. And he just lists everything out, okay, in the very first part. If you look at Pirkei Avot, the very Ethics of Our Fathers, which is a text probably around the 1st century BCE, I'm not positive. Those of you that are online or have access, you can look it up. I don't know the dating of that document, but the very first one says the same thing. Moses received the Torah from God and he passed it on to Joshua, et cetera, et cetera. What's being passed on isn't the written Torah necessarily, it's the entire Torah, this interpretive tradition, as it were, or how to do the Torah. Does that make sense? Okay, yes. You have a question?
You said there were three things: the Torah, the Mohabban,
The mitzvah,
and the
and then
mitzvah.
hora'ah, which is
That one?
instruction.
Okay, that's what I was, if the mitzvah is the oral law of instruction, so.
It
the
seems
Mohabban
that
is
way,
also
but but again, we're talking about rabbinic interpretation. That's going to justify the existence of the Talmud, which I'll come to much later. Okay? Not much later, but soon. Okay?
Okay.
So far.
So there's the written law, which is the Torah, the scrolls that we have in the Ark.
Yeah,
And then there's the oral law, which eventually became the Talmud.
not exactly. The oral law, that is close. The Talmud is hora'ah. Talmud is, think of it that way, but I'll
to
describe
that.
what is the Talmud, for goodness sakes, you know. The Talmud does consist sometimes of midrash, sometimes it does consist of a lot of quotations from scripture, and there's a redacted version of the oral law, an edited version of the oral law. Okay, I'll come to that. That's called the Mishnah, and Mishnah plus the discussion about what the Mishnah means is the Talmud. Those two, that's the core of the Talmud. Okay, but we'll come to that. It's a good question. Is this helpful, by the way, to everyone? Is this kind of interesting?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not putting people to sleep. Okay, good, because this, you know, yeah, I like it because, you know, I studied this and it's my thing, you know, but, okay. Another example, of course, is how are we to observe the Shabbat? Some of you may know that the traditional Jews have based the observance of Shabbat on what's called melachot, what constitutes work. Okay, and that's all found in Mishnah, which is a redacted, edited version of the oral law, and Talmud as well. In fact, there's a very thick volume of the Talmud that's devoted exclusively to Shabbat. Now, it's not everything in there is about Shabbat. They diverge into all kinds of other things sometimes, but the core of it is about Shabbat and and what constitutes work. You know, I'll give you a simple example. If I take a box, okay, and I carry the box outside on Shabbat, that's work. Because I'm taking an object from a private domain into a public domain. That's considered work. If I move my piano and move furniture, now that's not in the spirit of Shabbat, but I'm not violating anything, even though I've worked up a tremendous sweat, even though, you know, it feels like work. You shouldn't do that because it's not in the spirit of Shabbat, but I haven't violated the Shabbat. And Rabbinic Judaism is concerned about violations. What are you permitted to do? What are you not permitted? What constitutes a violation? What does not constitute a violation? Judaism, in some respects, is not, there's a significant aspect of Judaism that is not on the surface spiritual, but a lot of it, some of it, not some, I've never done data, and I'll leave it to AI to figure this out, what percentage is and what percentage isn't, but it's very concerned with violation. Why? Because there's penalties involved in the Torah that get invoked. I'll give you an example. It's a little known example, but it's a good example. My Bible professor, you'll get a kick out, well, I don't know if you'll get a kick out of it, was concerned about, the meaning of the word tin'af in the Ten Commandments, which means adultery. Lo tin'af, you shall not commit adultery. And he looked up at this, and his academic scholar said, I don't really know what that means. So I turned to a colleague of mine and I said, well, he may not know, but my wife surely knows what that means. And I know what that means. But you'll be interested to know that the commandment is only violated. It's not saying it's right, okay, but to invoke the penalty, which is what rabbis were very concerned about, only involves if a male has relations with a woman who is married that's not his wife. If the man goes out and has relations with someone who's not married, that's not a violation of the commandment to invoke a penalty, which is what the rabbis were concerned about. It's not to say that it's right, and they would never, ever condone that, but does it invoke a penalty? So when I talk about violations, it's in a kind of a religious criminal sense, and not obviously spirit. There's no big discussion that I'm aware of about the essence of marriage. There probably is, and probably Ketuvot, which deals with marriage contracts. We won't do much with that. So another good example is I once watched the TV. I was watching the news, and I was working on my dissertation, which dealt with lex talionis, which is the law of retribution, and particularly the phrase "eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth." Right? You've all heard that phrase. And this woman who was on a jury and convicted somebody of a crime that involved, physical hurt. At the very end, she said, well, it's just like the Bible says, eye for an eye, right? That was the basis for invoking the penalty that the jury decided in this criminal case. And I looked at the screen and I said, that's wrong. That's not what that phrase means in rabbinic Judaism. Eye for an eye means the value of an eye in place of an eye. It's not understood to be retribution. It's understood to be restitution. I won't go into the whole meaning of that, but that's what the oral law comes to teach us. My dissertation was based on that. Now, you can agree and disagree and so forth and so on, but it's a window into how the Bible was understood, at least by the 1st century BCE and in the time of Jesus and so forth. The Pharisaic understanding of the Bible not being literal, but in many respects being figurative. Yes.
Well, I was just thinking about adultery.
About what?
Adultery.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you said that it was only a matter of incurring a punishment or something.
Yeah.
If the man.
And I think it was death, if I'm not mistaken.
If the woman he had relations with, the married man the woman was married. So if she wasn't married, then he wouldn't incur. Doesn't that have something to do with the fact that men could take more than one wife back in those days?
That's a good question. Yeah. But you can have relations outside of the marital framework. It's not encouraged. It's not the right thing, from a traditional religious standpoint. That's not spiritual behavior. That's not, but does it incur a penalty? The answer to that is no. There's condemnation of that, but not, do you go before a bet din and get punished for that? The answer to that is no, you would not be subject to any kind of, you might be subject to tochecha, meaning rebuke, for that kind of behavior. And there were social norms. I mean, I left yeshiva because there was a principle called nigiyah. They wanted to protect you from that, so you weren't even allowed to touch a woman. You couldn't touch a woman. And, I was 18 years old, I was in yeshiva, and I left over that. I did, because I knew that the norm was not to do that. And I became Orthodox, had a girlfriend, and, we were, that's enough. But suffice it to say that we were not being Nagia. I'll leave it at that. Okay. I was a teenager,
Was it when he interfered with a married woman, he was interfering with the contract of the married woman and with the male, the other family relationship?
Well, that goes to the rationale of adultery, right? Because it does destroy. And there's a clause in the marriage contract. See, unlike in, say, Catholicism, I don't know what it is in Protestantism, but in Judaism, you don't make a vow. You don't have marriage vows. It's a contract, because even in the Torah, even in the 5 books, it's a mitzvah d'oraita. It's a commandment from right out of the Torah, that divorce is permitted. The husband may give a bill of divorce, to his wife. And the reason you don't make a vow is because once you make a vow, that vow really can't be broken. And vows were taken very seriously in Judaism because of the penalty of thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain. You violate that commandment. So vows, I'm just giving a rationale, vows were never part of the marriage ceremony. And to this day, sometimes, I counsel, they want to make their vows, and it's very understandable. It's a very sacred ceremony. It's a very beautiful ceremony. And I try to dissuade them from doing that. In Catholicism, I mean, God's presence is right there. And that's why, from a theological point of view, divorce is very, very difficult. And they adopt, for purposes of annulment, they adopt the Jewish view, or they adopt the Talmudic view, or maybe the Talmudic view adopted the Christian view. It's hard to know which came first, because the Talmud is 425, and by that time we have Christianity. But if there were circumstances that were not revealed, like a fraud, say for example, the groom was an alcoholic, okay, and when he got drunk, he would get violent. But in the process of the courtship and leading up to the marriage, there was never any evidence that, they'd go out and have a glass of wine, but he never got drunk and never acted violently towards his spouse after it invested. So had she known that, she never would have married. And so the vow was set up under false pretenses. In those kinds of circumstances, you can annul. But the reason you're annulling it is not because of the marriage, you're annulling it because of God. And I respect that. I mean, I think that's, we don't do that, but I certainly respect that. I don't think it's wrong. Now, sometimes, I'm just talking about theoretically and theologically. I'm not talking about what actually happens in practice. That's a different, that's not my area. Okay, should we go, should we continue? Any questions at this point? Okay, I'll just.
Everything.
Great, okay. Our technical guy is leaving, but I think I know how to turn it off and oh, you'll do it. Okay, great, terrific. Take care. Thank you so much, Andy. So, so the Torah has 3 forms of literature. Just to be clear about that, there's 3 different styles of writing in the Torah. The first, the most obvious, is a narrative. It tells the story of the Israelites from creation of the human being, or the creation of the universe, all the way through to Moses' death. We're only talking about the Torah. We're not talking about the other 2 books that comprise the Jewish Bible. When we talk about the Jewish Bible, we're talking about the book of prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah. And then we're talking about the writings, which would be like Psalms and Proverbs. The book of Daniel is also in the book of writings and so forth, because that book is written during the time of the exile. The book of Jonah is another one. You
Is
have,
Esther?
what's that?
Is Esther?
Esther, yeah. Excuse me, I think Jonah is actually in the book of prophets because it takes place during the time, prior to the exile. But Esther takes place after the exile, takes place outside. And so therefore it's not included within within that part of it. Those three divisions of the Bible, I'll hold up a thing here, okay? This book, I'm going to show it to our audience. Is the Hebrew represents the Hebrew acronym Tanakh, Tanakh. The T stands for Torah. The N sound of like Tanakh stands for Nevi'im, which is prophets, and the Ch sound at the very end, the guttural Ch, that's the Hebrew letter Kaf, stands for Ketuvim. And so it's an acronym, Tanakh, meaning those are the three sections that comprise the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible ends with Chronicles. It ends where the New Testament begins. We don't, again, we're talking for those who are not Jewish, our Bible ends where yours begins. And I've said this before many, many times, that represents a dividing line between Judaism and Christianity. And that's why it's, that's why, again, I'll just give a little, that's why Messianic Judaism is really Christianity practicing Jewish rituals, because they do subscribe to the divinity of Jesus. And thank God we live in a country where understanding, I don't like the word tolerance. It's like, well, I tolerate that. I think where understanding is promoted, and goodwill. There is a certain humility that religious people, truly religious people, have, and it's not one of religious superiority. It's one of acceptance and appreciation of difference. So we end where you begin, and Messianic Judaism, since it incorporates the belief of Jesus into its ritual practice, they are Christians practicing Jewish rituals. And we live in a free country, and that has to be respected, as much as anything. Okay? Do I like it? No, I don't. But I also respect it because of the nature of the society that we're trying to create. That there's room for everyone. There should be room for everyone, as long as the exercise of my freedom doesn't impinge upon somebody else's freedom. Where I end should be where another person begins, and vice versa. Where one person ends, that's where another person begins. And communication builds the bridges. Okay. So the three is narrative, legal. There's legal provisions, thou shalt not. I think that refers to apodictic law. That's a big fancy scholarly word. You probably know this better than I do. Apodictic is more like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. They're legal principles or principles of law, but they're not subject to a dependent clause, right? So, and then casuistic is if such and such a thing should happen, then you must blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of that. If you see your neighbor struggling on the street, then you should help him. That's casuistic law, okay? I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Casuistic. I don't think it's casuistic, even though it sounds like that should be the way. I think it's casuistic law. Is that?
I think it's pretty close.
Yeah.
That's the way I tended to pronounce it sometimes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
I had a professor at law school that did it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's right. Casuistic.
Was that the number 3?
And no, that's number 2.
Okay.
Number 2 I'm going to give you is poetry. And poetry appears in about 2 places in the Bible. One is the Song of Moses, which we actually unrolled the Torah this morning for our kids, and you can see that. And the other is a passage at the end of Deuteronomy called Ha'azinu, which is a vision of Moses of what's to come and how the children of Israel, it's a very terrible way for Moses to go out, and he's really talking about how the Israelites will violate the Torah and how they'll be dispersed and all kinds of but it's written in a poetic form. And the poetic form we're not really too concerned with. Okay? All right,
Is that what's called the Song of Moses?
what's that?
Is that what's called
That's
the
right.
Song of?
That's right, the Song of Moses. In fact, Mendelssohn, who wrote no, I'm sorry, Handel. It was Handel that wrote the Messiah, right?
Yeah,
Not
Handel.
Mendelssohn. It was Handel, right?
Mhm.
Right, Handel's Messiah. So the phrase, and he shall reign forever and ever, that's from the Song of Moses.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, he took that, that's fine, that's, because I know that in Christianity, the Hebrew scriptures play an important part.
Mhm.
So, so that's that. So now let's go to the oral law. Now we've kind of covered, the Torah in a broad way. Let's talk about the oral law, right? So the oral law has basically 2 components. One is midrash, right? And there's 2 kinds of midrash. They're not mutually exclusive. One is midrash that is agadic, it's homiletic, and it's usually based on the narrative. Here's a simple example, okay? That when the Israelites were at the mountain, at Mount Sinai, they stood, it's always based, not always, but 98, 95, 90% is based either on some logistical problem in the text, or it's based on, a lot of times based on the Hebrew grammar. There's a problem with the grammar. And the problem so you have to know biblical Hebrew, you have to know biblical grammar to really appreciate what the creativity that's involved in this. For example, and I'm not going to get into this because I'm going to run out of time. We're not going to we'll be able to cover everything. So we'll continue this in the next one. There's a problem in the first word of the Bible, Bereshit. Some of you are nodding your head. If you want to, you should feel free to tell me what the problem is. I don't want to put anybody on the spot because it's a little bit, it's not complicated, but you have to know biblical grammar.
In the beginning, it means in the beginning, doesn't it?
Right, in the beginning, what's missing?
God created the heavens and the earth.
Well, that's how you would interpret it in the English. But there is a grammar, and that's what they do. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. But did you want to explain what the problem is?
The subject is not in the place you would expect it to be.
Yeah, there's not an object. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
written in in the biblical Hebrew, it's written in what's called smichut. And in smichut, you have to have an object of preposition. If it's written in a certain grammatical construct with reshit is, then you need in the beginning the literal translation. If you really, and my wife just pointed it out to me, and she's right. It's bereshit me, which means in a beginning. It doesn't mean in the beginning. It would be bareshit, right? But bereshit is in a beginning, which suggests, if you read the Zohar and you study Jewish mysticism, that there's been more than one universe, that universes have been here and they have collapsed and they have been, and new ones have been created. We're like in, I don't know, I'm making this up, I think. We're in the fourth universe of a number of universes before we get to the final. God destroyed previous universes.
Is that Kabbalistic?
Yeah, that's all Kabbalah, that's all,
That's
but it's
Kabbalah.
based on that grammatical issue. Bereshit, it's not Bareshit, okay? So Bereshit has the problem of the word Reshit, I mean, it should be in a beginning of, okay? So God's even if God is imperfect, okay, even if God makes mistakes, okay, let's assume he's not going to make a mistake on the first word. Right? I mean, you're not going to make a mistake there. You know, you're going to make a mistake in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but not going to make a mistake on the very first word. No one does that. Right? So that gives rise to a midrash. And I won't go through all the steps, but basically,
An
I'll
explanation.
go through various steps. The word Reshit appears in Proverbs. And if you go to Proverbs 8:22, the Reshit word is used. In the beginning, it's something that said I can, Bereshit Darko, in the beginning of his ways, and the God at the start of his work, something like that. So that's a reference to creation, right? So now in Proverbs 8:22, there's a reference to creation where the word Reshit appears in his way, but that's not the Darko. There's a speaker in chapter 8 of Proverbs, and the speaker is wisdom, and wisdom is synonymous with Torah. Okay, so there's a midrash that goes something like this: in the beginning, God consulted with the Torah in the creation of the universe. So you say, well, come on, you know. But a midrash, okay, so you would make a drash out of that. You would make a sermon out of that, saying that there is a moral universe. That with respect to the universe, there's a moral universe that God consulted in designing creation. Creation just isn't simply about physical matter. It's also about how the universe is supposed to operate. And in order to understand how the universe is to operate morally and ethically, we look to a source of wisdom, and wisdom and Torah are synonymous. That's a midrash. Another one, a very famous one, is when the children of Israel stood betachtit el hahar, which in English you translate in when the children of Israel stood at the base of the mountain. But the root of tachtit, see, that's also in smichut, but you have your direct adverb. Betachtit el hahar, you have your object at the base of the mountain, or the base to the mountain. El hahar is really to. So it's a little bit not as precise as we'd like it to be, but in the art of translation, you make it understandable. Comes from the word tachat, which means underneath. Tachat, tachtit is base of. Tachat literally means underneath. So here's the midrash. God actually, when God offered the Torah to the children of Israel, he picked up the mountain, inverted it, and said, unless you accept the Torah, this will be the end of you. And at that point, the children of Israel said, they take another verse, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we will follow it. So what would be the midrash there? The midrash there could go something like this, that it's understood to be a parable. Not that God literally picked up the mountain, but the children of Israel's existence would have probably ended in the wilderness had they not accepted the Torah. They would have gone the way of other ancient civilizations. And it's because of their devotion to Torah that we are to this day. That's nice. Those are all very nice, and all very. But in traditional Judaism, these midrashim were given by God to Moses. That was the understanding, the real understanding of the verse. Maimonides, later on in the 12th century, makes reference to that. Now there is halachic midrash on the legal sections of the Torah, and I don't have good examples, and I'll get some for you later. Now, the oral law, there is an edited version of the oral law, and this is going to come to your point, of the legal sections of the Torah. And the edited version of this portion of the oral law is called the Mishnah. Okay? And I'm going to talk about this for a second. The Torah, as it's written, according to traditional Judaism, is perfect. It's from God to Moses. But what about this oral law? does it have the same status as written law regarding perfection? Because God explained the Torah to Moses and all its interpretations. Well, if it's an oral tradition, or oral law, and it gets passed down from generation to generation, and we're looking chronologically from 1250 to the period in which this oral law became the Mishnah, we're looking at a period of time of 1400 years. So if you've ever played telephone, you know that just things can get messed up pretty quickly. Not that things got messed up, but because it was oral and was taught in an oral way and was never written down, there's going to be, by logic, variations.
But that's not part of the Torah.
Right. It's not part of the written Torah.
Right.
That's right. It's not part of the written Torah. Okay. I mean, and what I'm telling you is every traditional Jew would say that. I'm not giving you something that is reformed by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. This is traditional Judaism. And everybody agrees that the Mishnah was written, compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi somewhere around 200 CE. Now, I've read in other sections that it was compiled in a town called Usha in Israel with his colleagues around him. But when I went to the all-knowing Wikipedia, they attributed to Beit Sha'arim and a Sepphoris. So you can have your pick. I always understood it to be at Usha, but I stand corrected because I really like to research these things, make sure that I'm current on things. And Wikipedia, as we know, is the gold standard of research.
You can always correct.
Some of their
Wikipedia.
stuff is really fantastic, is really, yeah, there's stuff on the Talmud and there's stuff on religion, usually is written by scholars and is usually pretty good. I mean, really good. Though, if you want to hear something scary, I was playing around with AI when it was first coming out, and it was a chatbot or something like that. I forget the name of the AI, and I said, I would put in, write an essay, write a 10-page essay, something like that, on the Talmud, and I hit return. It was pretty good. It was scary. It was scary. I mean, there were some things that needed to be corrected, but not much. I mean, it was really powerful. Actually, I'm going to get a summary that it's not perfect, you know, and you have to edit and you have to, but it's pretty doggone good. You know, there's a lot of scary things about that. Okay. Now, the Mishnah in its own work, by its own admissions, is not perfect, which the Torah inherently claims it is. If you look at the Torah is regarded as being perfect. What it actually means, that's a different story. But as far as its divinity is concerned, in traditional Orthodox Judaism, because I want you to understand that, because then you begin to understand what are the fundamental differences between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Because you really can't understand those differences unless you understand this part of it. I mean, you can't appreciate that we all come from the same, you know, we're a redacted version of Orthodoxy, and I'll put it that way. We're redacted. We take much of what we do from traditional Judaism. So to understand how we evolved, we have to understand traditional Judaism. Because Reform Judaism, contrary to popular belief, did not throw out the Torah. They didn't throw out things. They reformed them to fit modern society. Okay, and so there's differences, but the core, if you look at the new prayer book, not so new anymore, the Mishkan Tefillah that we use every Friday night, and you look at an Orthodox Siddur, there's a lot of similarities, and I can point them out, where the verbiage is, there's some differences in verbiage because of theological differences, but there aren't that many. And there are some differences because of changed circumstances that Reform will do. But by and large, you know, but there's a lot in the Mishkan Tefillah that is in a traditional prayer book. Okay. Okay, I've got 5 minutes, right?
As long as you want.
So the oral Torah, though, is also considered the Torah by by traditional Jews.
So what sometimes get confusing, and this is my view, okay, for what it's worth, the oral law, the edited version of the oral law, and some people may disagree with me on this, but reading Maimonides' introduction to his one of really his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, which is a separate study in and of itself. But in the introduction, which is what I base my view on, is that the Mishnah is an edited version that covers all the topics that form the basis of the Talmudic discussion, and then some, because the Talmud doesn't take all the Mishnayot and comment on them. There are some where there's no comment whatsoever. The oral law itself admits to different opinions within the body of the Mishnah itself. For example, the very first Mishnah deals with the recitation of the Shema in the evening. From what time to what time may you fulfill the mitzvah of reciting the Shema in the evening? That's how it all begins. And there's three different views. Now, if there were no disputes about any of that, there wouldn't be three different views recited. Some say until 9 o'clock in the evening, some say until midnight, and some say until the break of dawn, the Birchat HaShachar, until the first light appears. And there's, maybe next week I'll bring that, and you can see that in the discussion in the body of the Mishnah there is dispute. So inherently, in its own literary form, it denies it to be a perfect, whereas the Torah is considered to be perfect, considered to be sacred. You can't take an eraser and erase verses out because you don't like them. You could theoretically if you wish, but but you wouldn't do that. It has a sacredness to it. It is, and any practice that you're doing has to in some way connect itself to Torah for it to be an authentic Jewish practice. Whereas the Mishnah is about defining parameters, not just about that. It has wonderful ethical pronouncements in different sections as well. But it itself does not admit authorship to be perfection. It's the best guess, so to speak, of what was said at Sinai by God to Moses, if you're going to characterize it, because of the time span in which it was written down. Yeah. Now, and I'm going to end on this note. There's a discussion, I believe it's in the Talmud, I'm pretty sure. And Maimonides, quoting the Talmud, it was forbidden to transcribe the oral law. It was forbidden for 1400 years. But the question is, why did Yehuda HaNasi and his colleagues decide to write it down? And by the way, we have the book. We actually have the Mishnah. We have the document. We have the document. We have a book. We have a translation, and so forth. That you can. In fact, I'll bring it next time. And with this, we'll stop. Why did he do so? Because conditions were very harsh, and the diaspora had begun. Jews were leaving Israel, and he was fearful that the oral law would not only be lost, but the practice would be lost, because much of what we do is dependent upon the oral law. So he wanted to make it concise so that wherever Jews went, they could take this with them and be able to practice Judaism and retain their Jewish identity. Yes.
I guess I was reading somewhere. Is this all related to the Gemara and the other? That is Gemara. Gemara.
Oh, Gemara.
Yeah.
We'll come to that.
Okay.
The Gemara. No, it's a good question. The Gemara is part of the Talmud. No. You pronounce it correctly. You pronounce it just fine. It's a good question. It's a very valid question. It relates very much to what Anne was saying earlier. What about the Mishnah? If you take the Mishnah, okay, and I'll bring the Talmud next time so you can just visually see it. You have the Mishnah is stated number one, and then underneath that, eventually when that ends, you'll see in the well, I guess Aramaic, a gimel and a mem and a slash, and the gimel mem is an abbreviation for Gemara. That's the discussion of the Mishnah. Now, I'm going to use the word discussion, we'll put discussion in quotations, because they can go off on what seemingly might be unrelated topics or topics that are tangential to the topic of the Mishnah. It's not like when we went to law school, you know, a lot of it is, a lot of what do these words mean and what do they mean in practice and what do they mean in relation to somewhere else? And how many of you are familiar with the song Hello, Goodbye by the Beatles? It's a long, old song, right? That's a good, simple description of Talmud. It's a dialectic. The Gemara is very much a dialectic. You know, you say yes, I say no. You say stop, I say go. There's this, what's called it's called a shakla v'tarya, answer, question, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And sometimes things are not synthesized. Sometimes discussions just go on and they'll go on to another topic, or they'll use the word tiku. I think that's the word tiku. Yeah, where well, it's an unresolved question, and all of these unresolved issues will be decided when the Messiah comes, and we'll find out what the correct answer is. So the conditions were very harsh. Jews were traveling. And scholarship, you know, was becoming increasingly difficult because of Roman rule, exile, and so forth and so on. So I think I'm pretty sure this is in the Talmud. Yohanan Hanasi was asked why he wrote the Mishnah. Now, don't forget, he lives around 200. The Talmud is written between about 425, and some people now say 700. So we're looking at the earliest 225 years later, we're ascribing a quotation to Yehuda Hanasi. He is saying, sometimes you have to violate the law in order to uphold the law, which is a very interesting principle. And sometimes we know that to be true. Sometimes we suspend constitutional liberties when we're fighting for the survival of our country. And you can argue, I don't want to get into the Japanese internment, which I think was a terrible decision, but you know, but sometimes you do have to, in situations of emergencies, you can't follow protocol. And how true that is in medicine, I'm sure. That if something needs to be done and it doesn't follow, and you got to violate protocol to do that, you just have to do that, and you take your chances, and that's what Yehuda Hanasi is saying. He saw conditions the way they were, the difficulty, and he was afraid that this would be lost. And so we have a debt of gratitude to him. Okay, I have 137, and I'm going to put down. This is where we've stopped, and we will pick this up next time with the Talmud. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank